All right, Cherie, you're hanging out with a lot of smart people at the Trinity Forum, and you're inviting people to think more deeply about how our Christian faith and the scriptures shape how we can imagine our civic life, our common life together. When I turn on the TV or when I go to like YouTube or whatever, and anything around politics or culture war stuff, it just seems like chaos. What are you seeing? How are you making sense of what's going on right now?
Yeah, well, that's a big question. And first of all, Caleb, thanks for having me on. I've been looking forward to talking with you. But yeah, it's not easy to make sense of it. As you say, things do seem to be crazy. I think there's several different threads that we can pull at. Um, one is we are perhaps the most distracted and distracting place in society. Well, let's back that up. We are probably the most distracted and distractible people that we have ever been. So there's so much coming at us, so much incoming. It's hard to kind of make sense of the world. There's already kind of a sense of distraction and disorientation. You add on top of that, we are getting so much of our information from not just social media, but from customized information streams fueled by algorithms that try to essentially capture our attention by feeding us an endless scroll of information that either confirms our biases or is custom tailored to outrage us and to make us think the people that we disagree with are absolutely insane, are out to get us, are evil to the core. In addition, we're seeing like a breakdown of community in many ways. We are a more secular society. People are less likely to go to church. Uh, families have been kind of, family formation has been less stable and less enduring for many decades now. People are less likely to be involved in community groups and associations. So people are lonelier. And, like the increase in loneliness is actually huge. And, we're not made to be alone. So what do? We go looking for community, and we often go looking for community online. And when you look for community online, usually you find it with a group of people that get really excited about the same things that you get excited about. And as anyone who I think has worked in politics knows, or even worked in the pastorate knows, it's a lot easier to get people really riled up and excited about something that they all hate or dislike than something that they all love. And so there's a new phenomenon, it's called affective polarization, affective with an A. And what that basically means is, sort of just that people are kind of finding some bonds with shared antipathies and hostilities rather than shared loves and priorities. And and because of that, they're getting into their little groups and getting more and more polarized. And then you add another sociological phenomenon on top of that, which is the law of group polarization. And what that means is that when you get a bunch of people in a room that basically agree on something, over time, the consensus skews towards the most extreme version of that. And you can see that play out all sorts of ways in party primaries, uh, in church fights, and the like. That that's where that goes. So essentially, we're spending far less time with each other face to face. We're lonelier on the whole, which kind of makes people more aggressive, more awkward, weirder. We're getting all of our information from essentially an algorithm that just reinforces and deepens our dislikes and our biases. And doing that to kind of find community with a group of people who share those biases and are getting ever more extreme. So, all those things are kind of feeding into kind of what we're seeing playing out, which is you go online, you turn on the television set, and it just feels like the world has lost its ever loving mind.
So, increasing tribalism,
Yes.
we're drawing really hard boundaries on who's the in group, who's the outsider. Usually, the outsiders are the baddies. we're alone more, and as communal creatures, we're desperate to belong. And so many of us are belonging to communities that define themselves by what they're against.
Yes.
So there's a lot of yelling. There's many of us at our dinner tables. We're nervous as we approach this next election cycle that, Uncle Bill is going to say that thing again, and we don't know what to do. We're navigating, should we invite this person or that person to the 4th of July barbecue, because even though we belong together, we're in this community, they seem to be very animated, maybe even anxious and ragey. What is happening to them in these spaces? Because I don't see them most of the time, but then when they come to the picnic, they're yelling.
Yes. No, it's a great question. And in many ways, your question also, it shows the different incentives from interaction in in embodied spaces where we're both together in person versus virtual ones. Like all the incentives are different. In virtual spaces, you actually get positive reinforcement through likes and retweets and engagement by being snarky, speedy, sensationalistic, extreme. All of that kind of gets you attention. It usually doesn't work all that well in real life in terms of either forming or sustaining relationships. So, we as a people are kind of spending more and more of our time through engaging in a medium of communication and engagement that malforms us, that essentially forms us for irrational, belligerent, kind of conflict, as opposed to what spending a lot of time with people that you care for but may disagree with does, which is, it forms you more for understanding, for some degree of forbearance. It requires a certain amount of graciousness, of forgiveness, of accommodation. So, what real life and real embodied interaction forms one for is almost exactly the opposite for what sustained social media engagement forms one for. And so when you take someone who has spent the majority of their waking hours watching extreme TV, being very online, um, retweeting, posting crazy stuff, enjoying the adulation or even kind of notoriety that comes with that, and then suddenly they're at your dinner table and you've got to deal with it. Like that's part of what's going on there. There's also the fact that when you spend that much time, online or just marinating in a steady stream of information that tells you the sky is falling, the other side is not just mistaken, but they are evil and they are out to get you and your family, and you essentially kind of marinate in that. It does a number on your thinking, on your sense of reality. And it's a precondition for conspiracy. And sure enough, that's kind of what we're seeing. And so that's, I think, what more people are seeing at the dinner table as well. And you ask kind of what do you do? I wish I had the answer, like, here's the 5-point plan, go enjoy Aunt Betty. But I can say a few things that don't usually work, which is it's very difficult to argue someone in the thrall of conspiracy theory out of the conspiracy. It just hardly ever works. I think it's often better just to be present, um, show them courtesy and hospitality, and care and concern, and that alone, hopefully, will be at a minimum, some cognitive dissonance in the kind of insular conspiratorial world they may be inhabiting.
That's good. So I think for many of us, we have felt a shock to the system over the last few years at how polarized our country has become, how polarized our families, our churches, whatever it might be. Um, it almost like it seems unprecedented. Has there been times in human history that communities have grown in I don't know, and it's such like reverted to such tribalistic tendencies? And how could we learn from some of those if there are?
Oh, it's a great question, Caleb. And you know, it in response, on one hand, social media is a new phenomenon. So this part is a new thing in human history. But the human tendency to be tribalistic, to seek scapegoats, to try to instrumentalize and weaponize power, to marginalize others, the will to power, the urge to tyranny. All these are as old as humanity, and you know, we we worship a God who acknowledges these realities, and whose son set a big counterexample. But one of the things that we have found at Trinity Forum is we do try to make available a number of examples throughout history of different leaders, or I guess the influencers of their time, you know when they faced a similar situation, because there were similar situations, and they chose a different path, or like how did they relate to it? I mean, it's been said that the actual proves the possible. There have been times in history where this has happened, and you know and and obviously, we are all still here. There were some wise people who kind of stepped into their positions of leadership, and modeled different ways. One example that I'll mention, we have a reading, and I should say we publish quarterly readings where we try to draw on the best of literature and letters, in a way, kind of tenderloin some of the best works of the humanities for busy professionals. So we published one reading called Politics, Morality, and Civility. And in it basically features selections from Václav Havel. So Václav Havel was a poet, a playwright, and a dissident who was suddenly propelled to the presidency of the new Czech Republic right after the fall of communism. And when he was propelled to that position, the Czech Republic was in a bad way. It was um, deeply polarized. There was very little trust. There was a lot of conspiracy theories going on. The communism had just been overthrown, so suddenly that heavy hand of tyranny was lifted, and people didn't really know what to do. Crime rates were going through the roof. There was a lot of lawlessness. Former communists were rebranding themselves as capitalists. People just, they didn't trust their neighbor, and there was all sorts of alienation, kind of societal breakdown and the like. And what Havel did was quite interesting, and certainly countercultural, which is he actually took time off to go and reflect about what his hopes and dreams for his country would be, and how he might be able to achieve them. And he called those reflections, they was published a year or two later, just called Summer Meditations. And so this reading basically pulls from some of those summer meditations. And one of the things he says that I think is so interesting and important is he talks about the pressure that he was under, from members of his own party, and certainly from the electorate as a whole, to be more authoritarian, to basically make use of popular sentiment that wanted more of a strong man, to kind of build popularity for himself by pounding on the table and you know assuming more of an alpha male pose, and kind of lots of realpolitik. And one of the things he said is, like, he decided that would never work, that essentially to pursue the ends of justice, decency, humanity, civility, and honesty requires leaders in particular, but everyone, to act justly, decently, civilly, humanely, and honestly. And that to employ means which contradict the ends are the best way to destroy your stated ends. And it's a lesson that I think is really important and germane for our time too, And that, you hear this sort of talked about quite a bit. Well, one has to respond in a crazy way because the other side is doing it. You got to fight fire with fire. And one great thing, again, about the actual proving the possible, there are actual instances in history of leaders, very successful leaders, who deliberately took a very different route based on moral and spiritual considerations. And we're also convinced that it was practical as well as the right thing to do.
So at Trinity Forum, where you serve, you have explored a lot of different thinkers,
Yes.
taken the wisdom that they've captured in books and papers, and tried to apply them today. You've also done a lot of work with like thinkers who are alive,
Yes.
like people who can still talk. We don't just have to read their words; we can listen to them.
Still talk, still think. Yes.
Theologians, thinkers. What are some of the things that you've learned or experienced with some of these folks that you thought, man, that's really helpful for today? I wish more people could hear what this person had to say.
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, there's a number of our current senior fellows who I think are such valuable resources for our current moment. Including David French, Russell Moore, Pete Weiner, John Inazu, who's a law professor at Washington University. Um, many others as well. Ron White is a presidential biographer who looks at, the past examples of presidents and, including Abraham Lincoln, who, we were more polarized during the Civil War than we are even now,
Mhm.
and how he navigated those crises. So there is a lot of wisdom there. And you're right. I had the incredible privilege of getting to talk with a lot of these scholars and thought leaders, and interview them on topics like the one we're talking about today, and basically pick their brain. And there's a couple sort of common themes that have sort of emerged from those conversations, and one in particular that I'll mention that's probably germane to our current conversation is the extent to which our civic dysfunction and political polarization is linked in many ways to spiritual deformation. um, you know, I'm sure we both really wish that Christians were immune from some of the trends we've talked about, the polarization, the tribalism, extremism, the propensity to conspiracy thinking. Unfortunately, we're not. There's actually, plenty of evidence to suggest that self-reported evangelicals, and I know we might want to put an asterisk, around that, and what that exactly means. We can talk about that in a second. But self-reported evangelicals are the most likely to affirm, some or all of the Q conspiracy theory or different, COVID vaccine theories and the like. I mean, we're not alone in it, and there's certain nor are conservatives alone with it. There's plenty of that on the left as well, but Christians have not been all that different from the population as a whole. And just going back to even what we were talking about earlier, it- you know, the Christian life, we're called to, radical love of neighbor. Loving God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength, loving our neighbor as ourself. And even just the commands to love your neighbor and tell the truth would make such a difference if they were lived out in the public square. But, instead of, loving our neighbor, and of course, a precondition of loving our neighbor is generally knowing our neighbor, paying attention to our neighbor, talking with our neighbor. We are far more lonely and isolated and alienated, rather than being immersed in the Bible. We're getting so much of our information from the most ephemeral of media. Um, you know, Media which reward, again, speedy, snarky, sensationalized, and cruel and extreme. And of course, studying the Bible, this is deep immersion into words with, you know freighted with great meaning, that requires attentive study. Uh, it's a posture that's very much at odds with the way so much of us are formed by by the media, by the people, by some of the ideas around us. So, if one of the things that has sort of emerged is if Christians were deeply formed in Christian ways,
Mm.
formed for deep reading, deep fellowship, deep communion, deep commitment to each other and to Christ, that would actually make a huge difference in our current time. But that doesn't seem to be happening.
Yeah, certainly not in mass
That's
uh,
right.
across the board. And in fact, some of the places where I have seen people become disentangled from political extremism or toxic tribalism is in the context of the beloved community. Groups of Christians who, across ethnic, socioeconomic, and political differences, have committed themselves together around Christ. And one of the things that I think is so attractive to that is it's an exhibition of actual community.
Right.
Actual community, actual belonging means that I can share my differences, my political differences, my different views on economics or whatever the thing might be,
Right.
without fear of being expelled from the communion.
Yeah.
And a lot of these tribes, if you start asking the wrong questions, you get kicked out.
Yes.
I know that in conservative circles, if you say the wrong thing or you ask the wrong questions, maybe about like the integrity of a leader, you might be called a rhino, Republican in name only, which is a means of excusing someone from the tribe or the
That's
community.
right.
So, shifting gears just a little bit, thinking about politics now in America, we have a two-party system. There's the red team and the blue team, right? The Republicans and the Democrats. And in my lifetime, most like white evangelicals, there was kind of this working assumption like the majority of white evangelicals are like conservative voters. And even to the point to where in my upbringing, there was this conflation of conservative politics with conservative theology. Even how we talk about people's understanding of scripture, we use the same terms that we do for politics, the spectrum of conservative and progressive, and we've mapped that onto theology, which I think is detrimental to theological pursuits because they don't always often map on top of each other. However, we are in a moment where a lot of what's going on inside the red team doesn't seem to exhibit like Christian virtues. Uh, so I'd love to get your thoughts. You do a lot of work with people in Washington, D.C., and you mentioned folks like Russ Moore and David French, who, in my understanding, are more politically and theologically conservative, but have taken public positions against the toxic tribalism, the political extremism, the almost empire worship that we're seeing happening now. You're there. Uh, how bad is it? Like, is it? We're all watching it on TV, wondering like, have all the conservative leaders gone full tribalistic, or are there some who are still advocating for living a Christian virtue in the public square? What are you seeing?
Yeah. Well, one thing I think we're probably all seeing is the fact that for many Americans, politics is becoming a bigger part of their identity.
Mm,
And there do seem to be many Christians who are, in a sense, kind of sacralizing their politics. In that, we're called to, unity in the body of Christ. But increasingly, like, there are a lot of Christians who are using political issues as big wedge issues. And before working at the Trinity Forum, I spent quite a bit of time working in policy and in politics. And on Capitol Hill and in the White House. And politics is important. It matters. If you care about justice, you should care about politics. That said, politics is not ultimate. And I think that one of the things that we see happening is, in a sense, a kind of idolatry of politics.
Hmm.
Like the idea that this is the most important thing. And as our identities have gotten more political, our politics has gotten more apocalyptic. Um, and you see a lot of people who they seem to get a sense of purpose out of political combat. And that's kind of reflected in the fact that there's a certain valorization of extremism or cruelty, as if this is somehow like bravery or principled conviction, or the like, which I think is a real deformation of kind of how we're called to live. When I worked in the White House, I worked for President George W. Bush and First Lady Laura Bush, and when you work in the White House, you go out and often people will take that as an invitation to come up and tell you all the things they don't like about the current president or the current policy or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And that's never pleasant. It's never fun. And especially when you're often the one working
Right.
on that
Yeah.
particular,
That was my project.
you know. But President Bush never, and his staff, I don't think felt the kind of sense of like, well, any questioning of policy is an attack upon my person. He did not encourage that kind of stance, and I think really one could argue how successful it was, but certainly tried very hard to be to represent all of America, not part of America, not just part that had voted for him. And that I think is seems to be increasingly lost. I mean, you hear particular candidates tell their followers that an attack on him is an attack on them.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
that is a really unhealthy way to see politics. Like one's identity should be bigger than that. Um, and as Christians, we're called, to essentially ground our identity, in being loved by God, which is, so much bigger, more beautiful, more life giving than grounding your identity, you know, in some aggrieved belligerent candidate. That's yeah, that's a real malformation. So see that happening, and it's one of those things where you think like, oh gosh, we are called to and offered and promised so much bigger and better.
Yeah. That's so good. So, how much of the White House is like the West Wing TV show?
Well, I certainly cannot speak for recent White Houses. And I have a
Okay.
feeling that they might be
Okay.
a little bit different than they used to be. But,
Did
um,
you walk through the halls engaging spirited, highly educated dialogue?
well, there's certainly a fair amount of spirited dialogue
Okay.
that goes on at the White House. I'm not sure all of it is, highly erudite, but it can certainly be spirited. I think they probably compressed a lot of the drama for the sake of the show.
Yeah. Well, with the TV show, The West Wing did more for me than my high school civics class, so I'm grateful. Uh, so you, as a follower of Jesus, made a decision to get involved in actual government, and that, for many of us, we see a lot of, our engagement with government is through rhetoric, um, through stump speeches, through attack ads. We for many of us, we just can't quite see like past that, like actual real life.
Mhm.
Um, I know that one of the things that you focus on with Trinity Forum is um, living out the character of Christ in civic life. And I know a lot of the people that I engage with and work with, we find it very difficult to believe you can actually do that in government. What is your perspective on living as a follower of Jesus and engaging in the uh, governing of a kingdom of this world.
Yeah.
I think for many of us, we think about biblical characters like Joseph and Daniel and Esther and try to learn from that, but you've actually done it. So,
Mhm.
how did you see your faith impacting being involved at that level in government?
Yeah. So, I should say I've been at the Trinity Forum for 16 years. So it's been a while since I've been involved in government. But yeah, there were definitely many examples, I think, of men and women who, sought very sincerely and conscientiously to live out their faith in public life. And it often looked very different than what I think we've become conditioned to expect now, in that we are, and there are people with with interest in kind of fomenting this expectation that somehow that conviction or kind of a principled stance requires loud, trash talking, belligerent, a lot of it performative belligerence before an audience, on some, you know, one issue or the other. You know, you think in contrast about what theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, how he defined and described politics as offering proximate solutions to insoluble problems, which essentially acknowledges that in a fallen world, our needs are always going to exceed our resources. People of good faith or mixed motives are going to see things differently. That both ends and means are going to be contested. That a lot of times decisions have to be made where there's really no good outcomes. Information is insufficient. You're under time and under pressure, and have a stomach ache and all that kind of stuff. So, a lot of it is just trying to make the best decisions one can, given the realities that one faces, and to do that to do that wisely and faithfully, and in a principled manner. Increasingly, people are conditioned to believe that any kind of concession is capitulation to evil or compromise on principle. And, in a democracy or, in a republic, you know, compromise and concessions are essential. Without them, you essentially have just, you know, uh, ever more escalation into civil war. And part of what pluralism is it doesn't mean all agreeing with each other. It means finding a way to resolve deep differences outside of violence, and one still contends for what one believes is right and true, and tries to persuade others. And so I think there have been many examples of, men and women and in Congress and the state houses and the governorships, and in the White House, who have sought to do that. What is increasingly sort of admired or valorized now are people who aren't actually accomplishing all that much, but are really good at denouncing their perceived opponents and doing so in kind of clever or snarky ways. And, not surprisingly, what has accompanied that is Congress really hasn't done all that much. They're not able to pass, important pieces of legislation. They're not even able to pass a budget or even part of a budget. It's for many years, like there's barely been one appropriation bills passed. So the very basic, what people are elected to Congress to do, the very basic responsibilities of their job, they're not able to get done because they're busy essentially performing for the cameras or social media. So when people seek to do their job, it may not lend itself to kind of a social media superhero in the culture war kind of picture, but there's actually tons of examples, I think, of people who have tried to do that faithfully and quietly throughout the years. One thing kind of related to that question that I'll mention is, which is a concern, is because things have been like kind of so off for several years now. One concern is just like, gosh, where I kind of think about like the young people who have come of age in the last decade or so, how their political imagination has been formed. And so the ones who are kind of going into politics now, what do they expect that it will be like? What has attracted them to that? Because it does function or not function in a very different way than it used to, really not that long ago.
Yeah. So we're in this moment where we're being invited, A, to practice the way of Jesus, B, live as citizens, not only of the kingdom of God, but also for those of us that are America. As a republic, we're invited into the political process. Just in our last few minutes together, would you speak to how we can better imagine engaging in civic life, common life together?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. One thing I will suggest, and this might seem a little bit crazy, but I do think that one thing that anybody can do, which is in some ways like very modest little cultural counter liturgy, I guess you could say, to our distraction, loneliness, and tribalism, is to host a book club or reading group. And here's why I say that. At a time when we are increasingly lonely, distracted, people don't have friends, nobody can focus, people don't read important things, they have their brains addled by social media. What is a book club? It is, or a reading group. It's focused attention on a worthy text in the context of community and the spirit of hospitality. And one of the nice things about a book club too is it can actually enrich the conversation by people having different perspectives on the text. There's a sense of unity in that you've all read the same text, so there's a common basis for discussion. But there's also diversity amidst that unity because people have different perspectives. And one of the things you find is like you actually start to get a deeper appreciation for the person, as well as like a more complex or nuanced kind of understanding of the text. Like there's a certain stone soup aspect to it all. I think in some ways we have lost certainly our imagination, but almost kind of lost some civic muscle memory, in kind of just learning how to get to know each other across differences. And it's a really small way to get to know your neighbors, to welcome people into your home. I think the Christian virtue of hospitality is one that's, gosh, just needed more than ever. Yeah, it's a small and modest way to start, something that anybody could do.
Yeah, I love that. And I just want to affirm hospitality is the key. So we started this conversation noticing that we're becoming more tribalistic and polarized. And that is oftentimes being stirred up because we're afraid that we don't belong anymore.
That's right.
And
Yes.
things like hosting a reading group, host around a meal, discussing a concept or topic around a meal with people who are different than you. The hospitality component is what creates the safe space for me to process out loud what I'm thinking inside, which is true community. And I love that. And I know it feels modest according to the kingdoms of this world, but I would just notice that Jesus ate his way through the Gospels. His
Yes.
discipleship model was to put a bunch of people who are different than each other at tables and then figure it out. And I think that's what you're inviting us into. And these issues that we face are enormous, for many of us, deeply personal. When we're talking about politics, we're talking about people and how we love our neighbor as ourselves.
That's right.
And I'm just so appreciative of you and your work at Trinity Forum and the way that you're trying to help us think more deeply about how we can faithfully follow Jesus and engage in this common life together, given that not everybody around us follows Jesus. So thank you so much for being on the Disarming Leviathan podcast. Where can people find you and your work?
Yes. Well, I'm at Trinity Forum. Our website is ttf.org. And we also do twice a month, we do online conversations where I get to interview and talk with some of the most interesting scholars and thought leaders around on topics like this. So I would love to have folks join us. And Caleb, this has been a lot of fun. Really appreciate the invitation.
Yeah, thank you. One thing, where can we find those readers you were talking about
Yes.
earlier?
Yes. So these are also, you can order them off of ttf.org. And I think we talked about if your viewers would be interested in a digital download of Václav Havel's reflections. We will kind of create a code, which we could just call Disarming Leviathan. And if people go to our website and enter that code, we'll send them a free digital download.
Cool. And for those listening, we'll have that link in the show notes as well. Cherie, thanks so much for being with us today.
Great to talk with you.